Welcome back to the channel. In this episode, I'm going to talk about 1969 Boss 429 KK1213. It was a prototype car made to test the feasibility, obviously, of whether a Boss 429 could be made into a production car. I'm going to go over the history of the car, what I know about the car, and the current state of the car now. Full disclosure, the first restoration of this car was done by me, commissioned by the previous owner, and we turned it into the drag car as it always was known as back in 1969 until current day. What I'd like you to do, watch the video to the end. Look at all the information that I present. Let me know your feelings about what was done to the car. Truth be told, having restored the car and spent over a year of my life working on it to get it to the state that it was when it left, I was pretty upset to see what they did to it. But not my car. They can do whatever they want to the car. It's theirs to do what they see fit. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching my videos. Watch this one to the end. Let me know what you think. I'm looking forward to your comments. I read them all. This is the story of the 1969 Boss 429 Mustang known as KK1213. Dave Lyle is a noted Ford factory-backed racer through the 1960s into the early 1970s. He drove cars that he mostly built himself, which included his all-fiberglass 1965 Falcon Match Racer and his 1967 427 Fairlane, along with one of the 50 specially built 1968 Mustang Cobra Jet 135 cars that he ran in Superstock. In 1969, Ford contacted Dave again to tell him there was a car waiting for him at the Ford X Garage. It was a 1969 Boss 429 KK1213. This car would be his for the next 2 racing seasons. When Dave arrived at the X Garage, he received a mostly complete car, but at some point the deluxe interior had been changed over to a standard interior. Apparently, it was common practice for the mechanics at the X Garage to swap out parts from other cars that arrived there into their own personal vehicles, and KK1213 was no different. KK1213 was one of the pre-production test cars Ford used before production of the Boss 429 began in late January of 1969. Few survived testing and were destroyed afterwards. KK1213 was one of the lucky ones. Dave Lyle received KK1213 and at Ford's request proceeded to prepare the car to compete in Superstock drag racing in an effort to showcase the new Boss 429 engine. Dave pulled the original engine and transmission and sold anything that wasn't part of going fast and installed another race-prepared Boss 429 engine he was working on. Ultimately, the car saw little success in Superstock racing as it was not able to be made competitive in the class that it had to be run in. At around the same time, NHRA started developing a new class called Superstock X for the 1969 season. This class would evolve in 1970 into Pro Stock. The car was a perfect fit for this new class. A new, more aggressive engine with a custom-made tunnel ram intake and 2 4-barrel Holley carbs was installed. Wayne Gap, who was a friend of Dave's at the time worked at Ford, took the custom intake with him during the weekdays to tweak it on Ford's flow bench to make more power. Wayne Gap is better known for the Gap and Roush race team and the cars they raced in Pro Stock.
Cleans the tires and makes them tacky for better traction. Wayne Gap of Michigan, the fastest qualifier in a 4-door Maverick, going against 3-time Winter Nationals champion Bill Grumpy Jenkins of Pennsylvania.
The car had good success racing Superstock X and then Pro Stock, and has the distinction of being the very first 9-second pass in Pro Stock legal trim. Unfortunately, since it wasn't in competition, it didn't count. and Bill Jenkins was able to grab that official honor shortly thereafter. Dave continued to race the car in Pro Stock in 1970, but with a facelift as a 1970 model year Boss 429, as per Ford's request. He had moderate success with the car and found match racing to be better moneymaker for him and his family, often racing at several tracks in 1 week. With match racing and racing Pro Stock, Dave realized that he needed 2 cars. He picked up another Mustang Fastback and converted it to look identical to his Boss 429, except that most of the time it ran a tunnel wedge 427. In vintage photos, you can tell the difference between the 2 cars in the fact that the cloned car, Match Racer, had no front brakes. After the 1970 season, Dave Lyle and KK1213 parted ways. KK1213 was bought by Gary Horton from Ohio, who continued to campaign the car as a privateer in NHRA Pro Stock. The Match Racer ended up being sold to a local racer who wound up crashing the car and scrapping it because it was beyond repair. With the rapidly changing landscape of Pro Stock in the 70s, drag racers without factory backing found it very difficult to keep up, and Gary Horton was no exception. Gary had very little success competing in Pro Stock and ended up retiring the car. Gary kept ownership of the car. Then he saw the nostalgia drag racing scene starting to take off and brought the car back out, repainted it in the original livery used by Dave Lyle. He raced the car for years at these events until he realized that it wasn't just another old race car anymore. He retired the car again for fear of ruining a very rare and valuable car. Years passed and Gary sold the car to a collector from the Midwest. The new owner was now faced with a decision on how to restore the car, as originally raced or as an original car. After much decision, it was concluded to return the car back to as raced in its 1969 Superstock X form. At that time, collecting factory-backed race cars from famous racers was a hot trend, which helped sway the decision. The restoration was started and the car disassembled. Like most old race cars, KK1213 had gone through many changes since 1969, including cutting the rear of the car for bigger tires and gutting it for lighter weight. There was an effort to keep as much of the originality that was left of the car as possible, but extensive sheet metal replacement was needed. The car needed the entire floor and frame replaced from behind the driver's seat to the tail panel. An original floor was sourced from another 1969 Mustang, along with a staggered shock crossmember from an original 69 Boss 429 body that had been cut up decades ago. For the other sheet metal parts, NOS inner and outer wheel wells, tail panel, quarter panels, along with other panels were used. Although the original firewall did have modifications like being hammered out for header clearance, it was decided to keep it instead of replacing it so that those modifications could be seen and the car's history not questioned. It's pretty cool when one of the guys who raced the car can point to something on the car and said, "I did that." After all the repairs were done to the body, it was sent to Precision Chassis in Pottstown, Pennsylvania to have a replica of the original roll bar installed and a new pair of tubular headers built to mimic the original JR headers that were on the car. The car was then disassembled and sent off to paint. Since it was originally a black car, a decision was made to paint the door jambs and the trunk area black, as they would have been from the factory, then mask them off and spray the exterior body white as it was when it was raced. The car was then hand-lettered and decals applied as close to how it was back in 1969. Before the restoration work began, the original engine was bought back by the new owner and reunited with the car. In 1969, after receiving the car, Dave Lyle had sold that engine, but the location had been known. The original transmission gone, so another Boss 429 big spline top loader 4-speed was rebuilt for the car for the restoration. The car was reassembled, original Boss 429 engine and a replacement 4-speed. Dave Lyle was instrumental in helping with the descriptions of all the unique Ford experimental parts and aftermarket race parts that were used in the car so that they could be found and used in the restoration. The car was returned to the owner and placed in his collection. Time passed and it was traded to another collector who held the car for several years, then ended up going to the Volo Auto Museum. After it left Volo, its whereabouts were unknown until it showed up restored into a production line vehicle at the MCACN show in Chicago, Illinois, alongside a recreation of it as it was after the first restoration and as raced in 1969. From this point on, I'll not mention the name of the shop that did the second restoration of the car into a production line version, or the gentleman involved with it. I will say that the shop that did the work was primarily one that focused on restoring GM vehicles, so they enlisted gentlemen to help them who are well-known, knowledgeable persons in the Ford community. If someone's interested, there are YouTube videos featuring the car at MCACN along with those involved, and I encourage you to watch them, as some of what was said by the Ford experts doesn't quite line up with my experience with the car. I'll just leave it at that and let you draw your own conclusions from there. As far as the second restoration goes, I did not see the car in person, but from what I did see of the car in pictures online and videos on YouTube, it looks to be a very nice, although not concourse correct job done by the shop hired for the work. That said, there was one glaring detail that stood out to me that was different from when the car was in my shop. All Boss 429 Mustangs had the battery relocated to the trunk, and the positive cable ran forward over the passenger side wheelhouse, down along the rocker, then up through the firewall. KK1213 was a pre-production vehicle, and the battery cable hole in the firewall of this car was randomly made by hand and in a general location. Production vehicles had their battery cable hole made on the body shop assembly line with a template in an exact location. During this second restoration, the hole was moved from its pre-production location to the more familiar production line location. The reason why this was done is unknown. In the previous mentioned YouTube videos about the car, it was stated that another 1969 Boss 429 was sacrificed to restore KK1213 back to an assembly line vehicle. I don't know exactly what was meant by that, other than that they took all the parts off of that car and used them on KK1213. Possibly they used the firewall in the car as well, but it's just a shame they lacked the attention to detail to have the correct battery cable hole in the correct original location. To many people, this may not seem like a big deal, but a correct restoration of such a unique and important car like KK1213, and including details like this, in my opinion, are critical to its history. Much has been said by many people questioning the car's second restoration. All I can say about that is that, in my opinion, they created a car that never was. Being a pre-production test car, I highly doubt that the car originally looked like the car it is today, with items like pollution control system installed on it. That's my opinion. Others may disagree. I'd like to hear your thoughts about KK1213. Do you think it should have been left as a race car, or like it is today, fully restored? Why do you think the current owner decided to restore the car back to assembly line condition and not leave it as a race car? Do you think it may harm the history of the car in the years to come? Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.